on three important factors. First, on what are their views, if any, in general, on the recommendations which we have made in the Finance Commission. Second, that whether they had any specific suggestions to make in regard to any of the components of that recommendation, like on the vertical, like on the horizontal, the selection of the criteria for the horizontal devolution, and the weights which were really assigned to the horizontal. Then, in regard to revenue deficit grants, disaster management, and the resources which have been given for the third tier. Also, we wanted to ascertain their views on the fiscal roadmap, some of which is articulated in the report itself on the paragraph relating to the fiscal roadmap, and also the behavior of the key macro variables which the Commission could take into account in making its recommendations for 5 years. If they had any suggestions to make, the macroeconomic policy framework statement of the Ministry of Finance covers 3 years, but we have to give an award really for 5 years and not 3 years. So we did want to have their thoughts on what really we should give for the 5-year projections. So I must say that each of these issues they addressed in their own way. Some added emphasis on some things, some added emphasis on the other things, but on the whole, the interaction was exceedingly rewarding to the Commission, because some thoughts and suggestions came up which would deserve, and for which we have the adequate time and opportunity to be able to do so. So let me say stop here, and then ask any specific questions which any of you had. But I thought that since we had followed the practice earlier of having such a interaction with you after the meeting of the Advisory Council, I'd like to continue with that tradition of also wanting to have this interaction after this meeting. So you want to go first?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, the Finance Commission was looking to set up a committee to look at the fiscal roadmap for center and state. So what is the update on that?
But your memory is far too much for comfort. So you recall that I had promised you that, yes, this is an issue which I'd like to discuss, which I did. So the sense which I get is that, yes, there are issues on which I think that there would need to be further clarity, like particularly in relation to the states, the behavioral pattern of the GDP numbers, the debt, and so on which there needs to be greater clarity. I think that we need to also address the terms of reference contained in our report. I mean, this is not a new thing. This is embedded as one of the core terms of reference to the Commission, that they expect us to give them a roadmap on the issues of debt, fiscal deficit, overall management of finances of the general government, which includes the center and the state. That's one of the core recommendations. So there are areas on which there needs to be more work, more consistency of data, and that is why, yes, we have decided to constitute a fiscal committee, so to say, which is also address that one particular recommendation contained there on a legal framework for a fiscal architecture. Pardon?
Have constituted a fiscal committee.
I propose to constitute a fiscal committee, a broad-based fiscal committee, which will address some of these issues on fiscal policies, particularly in relation to the debt and fiscal deficit of the states, and as well as of the central government. So it will also enable us to give further thought, one way or the other, to a recommendation which in passing we have put out for discussion as contained in the report, that for a legal framework for a new fiscal architecture. Now, on that, I must say that it's just a thought, because I really think that whether such a legal framework would be useful or not, and would be practical or not, I myself have I have some thinking which is there. But certainly we need to have a fiscal roadmap which covers the center and the states, both on the fiscal deficit, on debt, on off-budget borrowing, of contingent liabilities, of leveraging through parastatals. On that, although the finance minister needs to be complimented that this year, in departure to the practice earlier, she has given a detailed statement on the off-budget borrowing and contingent liabilities and so on. And this is really a very notable, positive departure which she has done. But I think more work needs to be done on this, and the states certainly need to be brought in the picture.
So we already have an FRBM, and states have their own FRBM. So what kind of a legal architecture?
So there is, let me put it this way to you, there are two issues. First of all, we had an FRBM 2001, which was really put out in 2003. Then we have the FRBM amendment based on the recommendation of the committee which I headed, which was accepted as part of the finance bill of 2018. But the states have yet to align their state level FRBM to the FRBM as amended in 2018. What is the big difference? The big difference is that if you look at the earlier FRBM, the issue was fiscal deficit. Debt was not a principal macroeconomic anchor in the earlier FRBM world. And debt is now, in the new scenario, the debt is a principal anchor. And if the states were to align their FRBM with the FRBM of 2018, it would mean that this aspect would also be covered. Third, that there is far greater focus now on the issues of off-budget borrowing, contingent liabilities, and contraction of debt through the use of parastatals than was there at that time. The focus was quite a bit on the fiscal deficit, but the totality of the fiscal deficit and ensuring the congruity of the fiscal deficit numbers with the strict letter and spirit of the FRBM for the states as well as the center is an area I think that much greater clarity needs to be made. So I'm not saying we want a new law, but we do want greater clarity on how this issue that posed to us in the terms of reference needs to be addressed in a credible way.
Sir, by when can we hear something?
Now, next question.
We won't need a, let me miss that part. We won't necessarily need a new way.
We do not need a new legal framework, because what the FRBM already has is quite a robust legal framework, except for the fact that the states need to align their own FRBM with the new FRBM enacted by the central government with amendments to the earlier one in 2018. Also, we need to ensure that there is strict compliance on the issues of the off-budget borrowing, contingent liabilities, guarantees, and issues of parastatal. Yeah.
So you have
Just 1
8.5
second.
months.
Just 1 second. Yeah.
So, does that mean this committee that you propose to set up?
Propose to set up in a day or two. Yeah.
Okay. So, can you give us a sense of how big this committee would be? Would it include state level representation?
Well, let me put it this way to you. Looking at the fact that we have a limited time frame to give our final report, I do not want to make this committee unwieldy. I would not like to make this committee too unwieldy, but it is very evident that I certainly want to have a representative from the CAG, from the Reserve Bank, from the Ministry of Finance, have 1 or 2 people who are associated with the FRBM committee who are knowledgeable on this and consult one or two states. But it's not going to be one of those very big committees. But lot of data is already available, has been captured. It's a question of compiling, collating them, and making them consistent.
So would it be fair to say that the principal terms of reference of that committee would be to look into the alignment aspect, or would you look to
I think that it would be fair to say that the principal terms of reference of that committee would be to enhancing the ability of the Finance Commission to address its terms of reference, the terms of reference relating to giving a consolidated fiscal debt roadmap of the general government, which is including of the center and the states. So that will be the principal mandate, because that mandate comes out of the terms of reference, which in terms of the obligation we need to satisfactorily address.
So what if the panel suggests for a new law then? Or you make it clear that...
No. So they can suggest anything, but the purpose of this is for enabling us to address these terms of reference and to make appropriate recommendations to government. That is the remit and with the mandate of the Commission.
Will you only be heading that committee?
Yeah, I'm heading it.
And will you take inputs from former members of the FRBM committee like Dr. Ujit Patel, Dr. Arvind Subramanian?
No, I really think it's neither a question of yes nor no. As members of the committee, I propose to have a very small committee, and I do not, because I do not have the luxury. At that time, if you remember, I was only doing this. I have now, my most important task is to give the final report to the government, which involves many more things. But certainly the issues of the fiscal roadmap is an issue I want to satisfactorily address. Yeah.
Sir, are you expected some states, especially southern states, have expressed disappointment over reduction in their share in eligible food, Kerala, Karnataka, etc. And also in some states they are also in absolute terms they are getting less than what they got in 1920, in 2021. So there was a provision to allocate extra funds for those states to cover those districts. But the center has not accepted that.
So I have no comment to make on that. We made those recommendations which we did in our wisdom, and let me say that the central government is perfectly within its legitimate ambit, because we should not overlook the fact that what is obligatory constitutionally for the central government is the obligation to carry out or to accept the devolution part of it. So we made the devolution, which is 42%, 41 if you want to take out J&K, 41, 42%. We gave the revenue deficit grants, which is part of this Article 275 story. This the central government has accepted in its totality. In regard to other provisions, it is for the central government to consider whatever thing. And on this particular one, yes, it is true that the point raised by the central government has a degree of validity insofar as it wants us to consider whether it would be appropriate to introduce a new principle of flow of resources which has not hitherto been used. And that's the point on which you have been asked to relook at it, and I think that it's not a frivolous point, it's a meritorious point, because the central government has accepted the devolution and the overall financial module in terms of even a very large revenue deficit grants, a very large increase to the third tier, a very large increase in terms of the treatment of disaster management. So I think that they have been very, very fair in a certain sense to the constitutional obligations for a body like this. And there has been absolutely, it has been politically neutral, because as you can see, the shares of states, quite a few shares of states, which do of the fact that there are different hues of political parties, has in no way impacted either the central government's decision. It certainly never crossed the Commission's mind, because we have acted in accordance with the legacy which we inherited, namely of this acting as a neutral, impartial constitutional body.
So if you could also,
Yes.
can I say?
Yeah, please.
So if you could also give us a sense of what the advisory council, some ideas that came up in this morning's meeting from the advisory council as regards the fiscal roadmap and the approach that the commission could take.
So on the fiscal roadmap, several participants felt that it would be helpful if we do have a more detailed look at this issue of. Everybody appreciated, by the way, that there has been a very significant plus point that this time the off-budget borrowing, the budget has not only recognized it, and this was appreciated by the members of the, but they felt that needs to be greater clarity on states and on the compliance of states to debt and to the fiscal deficit target, and much greater transparency in regard to off-budget borrowings and in regard to parastatals and so on and so forth, and the comprehensiveness of this definition. And towards the end of that, I sort of said that I can see that there are pointers in the direction of what I should do. So I left it at that. There's points of view on the fiscal roadmap. For instance, the fact that in the medium-term statement, this year they have taken for 2020-21 3.5%, but also it must be said to the credit of the central government, and I applaud them for it, that every time they have, the FRBM Act said that anytime you invoke the escape clause, along with it you must have a return path to the path of fiscal rectitude and fiscal consolidation. And this has been articulated in the medium-term statement, namely 3.5 is to go down to 3.3, then to go down to 3.1, and then to end with 0. One other related issue is that there is a debt trajectory at the end of that. So if you have a much greater fiscal deficit than the one, then what happens to the debt trajectory to reach the preferred debt target of 60% by terminal date? Does that terminal date get postponed by 1 or 2 years? Now, whether it does or does not depends upon so many other factors, because debt is not only a product of the fiscal deficit. There are many other factors that enter the debt picture, like the cost of borrowing, inflation, interest rates, and so on and so forth. But that's also an area on which I think that we might like to give some thought to it.
Sir, because of the recommendations of your previous committee, the center enjoys this escape clause that you talked about.
Not enjoys, the center has the sort of option to exercise or.
What about the
It has
state?
been invoked now. What about the states?
Well, look, you can't eat the apple and also have the apple. So this escape clause did not exist in the earlier FRBM version.
Yeah.
This escape clause for the central government is in the version of 2018, right?
What you said.
So I gave you a hint that in case states wish to move over to a new architecture on the fiscal framework, well, that's the time when they can consider a similar provision to make it symmetric with the provisions of the FRBM, and that would be something for the states to decide. So that is, in my view, the obligation would be take on also a debt and a debt trajectory as an anchor, use fiscal deficit as an operational thing, and then some of the other features of the FRBM amended Act of 18, if they wish to have it, that's an option which will broaden for them.
They can have this option if
So they can suggest that to you.
They don't have to suggest it to me, it's their own law.
State FRBM.
It's their own state FRBM which they will need to amend. They don't have to ask the Finance Commission, but it's their option. But the option comes with an obligation. That obligation is that you need to also have, therefore, a credible debt trajectory. Okay. Huh.
Sir, in your interim report, you
No, it's not an interim report. It's a first report.
So
It's not interim, I'll tell you why, because this is a complete report in itself, which you would have seen.
Even economic survey writes about interim report.
So anyway, sir, in this report for 2020-21.
Okay, correct. Yes, sir. But at the time when they gave it, this report was not there. They must have written and gone to printers. Yeah. Okay.
So sir, in this report, the first report that you submitted,
Yeah.
you not changed the tax deduction criteria. You just given 1% of 1% point of tax, that is the center's share of tax to state of to Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So how do you plan to consider Jammu and Kashmir in your final report for the subsequent 5 years after 2021? Will it still be considered a union territory? Will it get a share of center's taxes or not? Because this time, since this was the first year, you just considered it as a state itself and given a part of center's tax to Jammu and Kashmir. So how will it be treated in the full report?
This is not the final month of my giving the report. This is an issue which I will address when I come to that stage.
Sir, I have a related question to that.
I'm sure you have got my answer.
I have a related question to that. 0.85 was supposed to be their share.
But yeah,
0.85 percentage point was supposed to be JK's share. 0.1.5% is additional as given for.
but I have given that for Ladakh also, because I have to take Ladakh also, a bit of room for Ladakh. Also, in case they wish to have the development plan or something, this is just a thing. I round it off to one.
Security related.
Pardon?
Security related.
Whatever be the factor, we felt that we calculated it and we rounded it off to 1%.
My question is whether this 0.1.5 percentage point could be kind of allocation for internal security kind of thing.
No.
Is it specific to
This is specific to, you see, if this wasn't arising, if I had modeled for 29 states, then it was 42. But I have modeled for 28 plus plus an additional 28 states and 2 union territories of J&K and Ladakh.
Yeah, but then so that money has been used from the same devolution pie, and instead of you selecting that, that comes through the center now. So basically, the state's share indirectly goes down.
How? Because the point is that don't forget that the 42 had been fixed by the 14th Finance Commission when they had modeled for 29 states.
Yeah, I get the point.
So the
So
seat
it's from
has
the same
changed.
pie.
No, so if it was 29 states, it's different than having 28 states, right? So I mean, that circumstance has also changed. And then what would have happened if I had, let us say, stuck to 42? Then the burden would have increased that much by about 1%. Yeah. Then.
So, going back to the advisory council, if you could share with us any other ideas beyond the
Quite a few. Quite a.
Sir, how are the advisory council members looking at the current GST compensation cess issue as well, because that affects the states quite a bit? And the government is of the view that they will be giving only the money that comes in the cess, but if the GST revenues itself are pretty low, then what happens?
So let me put it this way to you. There were several points of view to address that, your more important questions. I'll come to your GST thing in a minute. Like for instance, on the criteria itself, some of them felt that should we have tax efforts, just although only 2.5% has been given. Instead, for instance, could there be a criteria which prods them to optimize expenditure and to really look at expenditure outcomes?
So did they want a higher weightage for taxes?
They wanted either to eliminate the tax one and introduce the expenditure outcomes one as let's say, one possibility. Whether the weightage to the geographical area should be at the figure which we have given, or is there need for recalibrating the geographical area in a somewhat different way. Or for instance, whether some of the performance criteria, which is a separate thing, could be introduced in some form in the process of devolution itself, particularly to various other entities. So, or for instance, how realistic shall we be on making the projections, particularly on the revenue deficit grants? Now, it's possible that if you want to be exceedingly conservative by bringing down the growth rates of the states and of bringing down the likely revenue which they will realize, they will get lower growth rates. But if you don't, it may end up in higher revenue deficit grants. So these are all the options and plays on that on the horizontal.
Any viewpoints on how the commission is handling the population metric, right?
So let me say on the
Some states are
on the population metric, I must be truthful with you. There were no comments whatsoever. But I will tell you what we did, which you follow very well. That we brought down the weightage to population, but we introduced a new criteria, the demographic thing and the reverse thing on the TFR, which in a way recognizes really, and for that the figure of 71 census has been used. So the issue of the census of 11 versus 71 has also, to some extent, we have tried to balance this particular thing. There were no adverse comments on the population stuff.
So in its first report, the commission had spoken about another task force or committee.
Oh, by the way, on the GST, just 1 minute. That was your question. On the GST, there were a number of suggestions. I mean, for instance, so generally felt that the room for improvement in the GST is significant. One member kept mentioning about the going back to the reverse charge, which was introduced for some time but was discontinued, and felt that this should be reconsidered because it could be very revenue friendly. They also felt that in the compliance and so on and so forth, that needs to be a significant improvement. They all realized that the future of the revenue buoyancy was greatly tied to the future of the GST, and so quite some time many members gave many thoughts and ideas on the GST, which we shall pass on to the They also wanted a more systematic dialogue between the Finance Commission and the GST Council, that since we were also very much stakeholders, because now when we go to states and look at revenues of the states, bulk of it has been subsumed in the GST, and we are therefore stakeholders, and because when we do the projections also, I mean, what I mean is that GST is a very, very important variable. So they felt that there should be some way in which we can also have the opportunity to share our views periodically.
So there will be further
GST.
meetings between the finance.
I have not
Members
I have not contemplated that, nor is it going to be my initiative. But the members were said, the members not of my commission, but of the advisory council were suggesting.
Sir, in the report, there was another committee you spoke about, that is to look at the non-lapsable
That's the defense.
and national security fund.
Yes.
So, any update on that?
Yes, update is that the committee has been formed and the committee has been notified. I think that this notification is in public domain, and I think you can have a look at the terms of reference. And I intend to have the, I was waiting for the some of these political things, Delhi elections and all that to be behind us, because the Home Secretary is a member of that committee, and I intend to call an early meeting of that committee to be able to come to some conclusion or the other.
By when will it submit the report?
अभी तो शुरू भी नहीं हुआ तुम सब.
Is there a
Before October, clearly.
No, clearly it is an input in my report. So clearly it has to be well before we begin to write the report, and it has to be well before October, because we now know the hassles of writing a report.
So all the terms of reference, sir, for this committee would be same as what you suggested in your FI21 report, like alternate mechanism or assess, whether we need a
No,
non-lapsable
Sapna,
fund.
that is in the notification of the constitution of the committee itself, what the terms of reference of that committee are. So have a look at that.
In your original TOR?
No,
No, in the committee's TOR.
in the committee's TOR, this committee has been constituted some time ago. The terms of reference of that committee is mentioned in that, and have a look at that.
And sir, when was this notified?
So notified, I think,
Just recently in February.
it was in February.
And was headed by HS?
Which one?
The-
It's headed by me.
Sorry. Sorry, guys.
No,
My bad.
he is a member.
Yeah, that's what I'm really glad
And
to hear that.
since the HS is not a member of the
Yeah,
Finance
yeah,
Commission,
definitely.
we don't constitute,
Yeah.
a Finance Commission cannot constitute another committee headed by other than people in the Finance Commission. I mean, or Finance Commission Secretariat, anyway.
The transfer to the third tier seems to be more direct, so basically bypassing the state intervention.
No, the third tier, this time, we have given 90,000 crore. We have done several things. One, we have, when it comes to rural local bodies, we have covered all the three. And we have also covered the 6 scheduled ones, which were not covered by the 14th. When we had gone to particularly the northeast, they had complained that the hill autonomous councils, which function more or less like panchayats and so on, have their own rules, have been denied that. So we've covered that. We have covered cantonments, and we have covered all the 3 tiers in the rural one. And we have given enough flexibility. 50% of it is untied. 50% is tied to certain specified national programs, particularly drinking water, sanitation, waste, and issues connected to ODF, connected with that. For the rural, for the urban local bodies, we have divided cities into 3: 1 above 1 million population, 2 between 100,000 and 1 million, and the third one below 100,000. And each one carry their own mechanism. For instance, we are the first commission to have given some serious thought to pollution, because to tier 1 cities, which is the tier 1 of sort of million plus, 50% of what we have given is tied to reducing pollution, which in particular matter 2.5 and 10, to be monitored by the Ministry of Environment, which has assured us that they have pollution monitoring stations to cover all the metropolitan cities, and they would be giving the thing and acting in tandem with the Ministry of Urban Development, which will administer this.
So will states also contribute to this national security fund? How would money go into this?
Well, I don't know what this committee set up under my chairmanship. We are going to look at the issue first holistically. Do you need a non-lapsable fund, or you don't need it? I mean, to begin from first principles, we cannot come to just some conclusions on. So, do we not need? What are the possible sources of funding, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and so on this GST compensation fund also, there was a presentation that you gave to the GST Council as well, and
I made no presentation. I made some.
Remarks.
I made some
Remarks.
observations.
So
And
so your view was that this 14% compensation that is given to states should be in a way brought down. That wasn't.
I didn't
that
make.
included-
I didn't make such a observation. I did say that I did say that either the law. See, there is a very clear procedure for this 14%. It's embedded in. Arising from the constitutional amendment. It is embedded now in the Compensation Cess Act. That Act says 14% from out of the proceeds of the cess, and to be carried on for 5 years. So there are several issues. One, what happens if the realization from the cess does not really reach the 14%? That's for the central government to consider. And what happens to us, which means the Finance Commission? 2 years of it is covered by the 14%. Will depend upon how this is played out. And then, of course, the most important issue is what about the 3 years which is covered under no guarantees? There the states will have to definitely improve their revenue buoyancy significantly, because there is no, that is a totally unguaranteed free period. And I would therefore dread the idea in case the states really have to face a cliff on the debt and the fiscal issues, unless there is a significant improvement in the revenue buoyancy. And any alternative mechanism is not something which is in the domain of the Finance Commission. It is entirely in the domain of the central government, because they are the ones who piloted that, and it is for something for the GST Council to consider. But it is an issue on which a view needs to be taken. Enough?
So one last question, if I may. Was there
Please.
any specific recommendation from the advisory council on agriculture? Were there any ideas?
Well, let me put it this way to you. Yes, there were. But let me put it this way to you, that first of all, in agriculture, the grants chapter of the Commission's report is a fairly detailed articulation of the 3 or 4 important changes which we would like to seek in the agriculture sector, and we have suggested to the states to undertake preparatory work, namely the changes in the this Agricultural Produce Marketing Act being eliminated, Long-Term Contract Act, the leasing of it, and a suggestion was made today that why don't we consider also on credible land titles. Land titles are necessary because they all felt that this is one of the biggest handicaps for any private investment, is the opaqueness of land titles. So they felt that along with this, one of the important reforms which could be thought of is much greater transparency on titles.
Titles as a metric of devolution, or titles?
No. That the fact that they should be encouraged to have credible, verifiable land titles as part of the process of that segment in our report which covers the agricultural sector.
Sir, just 1 second, sir. Like, it's already below 14%.
What?
The realizations to the competition says kitty. I mean, the shortfall has already started from the current financial year onwards. So the problem already is present and critical. I mean, we can't even, like, what will happen for 2 years, we really don't know. So any kind of a dialogue, suggestion, anything that the center, states, FinCom would have in mind to kind of...
That's for the center and the states. We would be the recipients of whatever arrangement they or whatever decisions they take and what the GST Council takes. We cannot second guess that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.